2 weeks after the fall of Saigon, America went back to war. The last battle of the Vietnam era wasn't fought in Vietnam. It was fought over a cargo ship, the SS Mayaguez, seized by Cambodian communists. 41 Americans lost their lives rescuing 40 crew members. More rescuers perished than hostages saved. This is the story of the Mayaguez Incident, the last official battle of the Vietnam War, and a desperate attempt to restore American pride. Subscribe, because this story shows what happens when pride drives military decisions. May 1975. America was reeling. The Vietnam War was over, and America had lost. After a decade of fighting, after 58,000 American lives sacrificed, after billions of dollars spent, South Vietnam had fallen. On April 30th, 1975, the world watched as the last American helicopters lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Desperate Vietnamese clung to the landing skids. Others were left behind to face the advancing communists. It was the most humiliating moment in American military history. President Gerald Ford was in an impossible position. He had inherited the Vietnam disaster from Nixon. He had presided over the final collapse. His credibility, and America's credibility, was at rock bottom. America looked weak, and in the Cold War, looking weak could be fatal. Then Cambodia seized an American ship, and everything changed. The SS Mayaguez was a container ship, a modest vessel operated by Sea Land Service for commercial shipping. She was 520 feet long, carried a crew of 40 civilian merchant sailors, and was en route from Hong Kong to Thailand. Her cargo included U.S. government mail, supplies for embassies, and commercial goods. On May 12, 1975, the Mayaguez was sailing through the Gulf of Thailand in international waters about 60 miles off the Cambodian coast. At 2:18 p.m. local time, Cambodian gunboats intercepted the ship. Armed soldiers boarded and ordered Captain Charles Miller to stop engines. Miller had no weapons. His crew were civilians, not soldiers. He had no choice but to comply. The Khmer Rouge, the brutal communist regime that had just taken over Cambodia, had captured an American vessel. When news reached Washington, President Ford saw this as more than a shipping incident. It was a test of American resolve, a test of whether America would still fight. Ford was determined to pass that test. "We will not be pushed around," he declared. The response would be swift, dramatic, and overwhelming. The Khmer Rouge were not an ordinary adversary. Led by Pol Pot, they were one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. In the coming years, they would murder nearly 2 million Cambodians, almost a quarter of the country's population, in a genocidal attempt to create an agrarian utopia. In May 1975, they had just seized power. The world didn't yet know the full horror of what they would become, but their reputation for violence was already established. The Mayaguez and her crew were in grave danger. The ship was taken to Koh Tang, a small island about 30 miles off the Cambodian coast. The crew was initially held aboard, then transferred to the island, then moved to a fishing boat. American reconnaissance aircraft tracked these movements, imperfectly. Intelligence was fragmentary. No one was entirely sure where the crew was at any given moment. But one thing was certain: America had to act quickly. Ford assembled his national security team. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was adamant. This was about more than the Mayaguez. This was about American credibility worldwide. If we don't respond, Kissinger argued, every two-bit dictator in the world will think they can take American hostages. The ghosts of Vietnam hung over every discussion. America couldn't look weak again. Not now. Within hours, military assets were converging on the Gulf of Thailand. The aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea steamed toward Cambodia. Air Force fighters from Thailand prepared to strike. Marine units were alerted for possible assault. The plan took shape quickly: retake the Mayaguez by force and rescue the crew. There was just one problem. No one was sure where the crew actually was. The assault was launched on May 15, 1975. It was a three-pronged operation. Marines would assault Koh Tang Island, where the crew was believed to be held. A boarding party would retake the Mayaguez herself. and Air Force jets would bomb the Cambodian mainland to prevent reinforcements. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The intelligence estimates for Koh Tang were catastrophically wrong. American planners believed there were perhaps 20 to 40 Khmer Rouge defenders on the island, a small force that could be quickly overwhelmed. In reality, there were over 300 heavily armed Khmer Rouge fighters dug into fortified positions. They had machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Marines were flying into a trap. At dawn, 8 CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters approached Koh Tang Island from 2 directions. They carried 179 Marines, a force that would have been sufficient against 40 defenders. Against 300, it was suicide. The first helicopter approached the eastern beach. As it descended to land, the tree line erupted in gunfire. Machine gun rounds tore through the helicopter. An RPG slammed into the fuselage. The aircraft crashed onto the beach, killing or wounding most of those aboard. The second helicopter took heavy fire and crash-landed in the surf. Marines scrambled from the wreckage, some wounded, some drowning in the shallow water. A third helicopter was hit multiple times and crashed into the sea. Several crew members were lost. Within minutes of the assault beginning, 3 helicopters were down, and Marines were fighting for their lives on 2 separate beaches. It was a disaster. The Marines who made it onto the island were pinned down immediately. On the eastern beach, a small group of survivors from the crashed helicopters huddled behind whatever cover they could find. They were surrounded by Khmer Rouge fighters and taking fire from multiple directions. On the western beach, a larger force had landed successfully, but was immediately engaged. They couldn't advance into the jungle. The enemy fire was too intense. And the crew of the Mayaguez, they weren't even on the island. While Marines were fighting and dying on Koh Tang, the 40 crew members of the Mayaguez were being released. The Cambodians, perhaps frightened by the overwhelming American military response, perhaps for reasons never fully understood, had decided to let them go. The crew was placed on a Thai fishing boat and sent toward the American fleet. They were picked up by the destroyer USS Wilson at approximately 10 a.m. All 40 crew members were safe. The rescue had succeeded, but no one told the Marines on Koh Tang. For hours after the crew was recovered, the battle on the island continued. Marines who had been sent to rescue hostages that weren't there kept fighting Khmer Rouge soldiers who weren't holding anyone. Communication was poor. The rescue force didn't receive word that the mission had been accomplished. The chain of command failed to relay the critical information. Men were fighting and dying for an objective that no longer existed. Throughout the day, helicopters attempted to extract the trapped Marines. Every extraction was met with intense fire. Helicopters were damaged. Crew members were wounded. Some Marines couldn't reach the extraction points. By afternoon, the situation was dire. The Marines on the western beach were holding, but couldn't break out. The survivors on the eastern beach were barely hanging on. Air support helped suppress enemy fire. 7 Corsairs and AC-130 gunships strafed the Khmer Rouge positions. But the enemy was dug in too deep to be destroyed from the air. As darkness fell, the extraction became desperate. The last helicopter runs were made under fire. Marines sprinted across open ground to reach the aircraft. Some were hit before they could make it. By late evening, most of the Marines had been extracted. But not all. 3 Marines couldn't reach the helicopters in time. Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove, Private First Class Gary Hall, and Private Danny Marshall were last seen alive on the eastern beach, still fighting. When the helicopters departed, they were left behind. Their fate remained unknown for decades. In 1999, a joint U.S.-Cambodian team recovered remains from Koh Tang. DNA analysis confirmed they were the 3 missing Marines. They had been captured by the Khmer Rouge and executed. The last Americans to lose their lives in the Vietnam era were murdered after the battle was over. The human cost of the Mayaguez operation was staggering. 18 Americans lost their lives directly in the assault on Koh Tang. An additional 23 died in a helicopter crash in Thailand that was staging for the operation. 41 total losses. 50 more were wounded, many severely. 40 crew members were rescued. More rescuers lost than hostages saved. 3 helicopters were destroyed, 10 more were damaged, some beyond repair. And in the end, the rescue wasn't even necessary. The Cambodians had released the crew before the assault even reached them. By any objective measure, the operation was a tactical disaster and a strategic miscalculation. But that's not how it was portrayed. President Ford called the Mayaguez rescue a success. The media largely agreed. After the humiliation of Vietnam, America needed a win. The Mayaguez Incident was packaged as that win. "We showed the world that America still has teeth," Ford declared. His approval ratings jumped 11 points. For a brief moment, the country felt proud again. But the families of the 41 knew the truth. Their sons and husbands hadn't died in a victory. They had died in a confused, poorly planned operation based on bad intelligence and driven by political desperation. They had died because America needed to feel tough again. The aftermath brought investigations and recriminations. Congress asked hard questions. Why was the intelligence so wrong? Why wasn't the crew's location confirmed before the assault? Why did Marines keep fighting after the hostages were released? The military examined its failures. The coordination between services had been poor. The intelligence had been catastrophically inadequate. The rush to action had overridden careful planning. But no one was punished. The operation was framed as a success, and successes don't require scapegoats. The lessons of Mayaguez were learned quietly, incorporated into doctrine, and rarely discussed publicly. The Mayaguez Incident marked the official end of American combat operations in Southeast Asia. It was the last battle of the Vietnam War, even though it was fought in Cambodia, not Vietnam. The Marines who fought on Koh Tang were the last American service members to engage in combat in the region. Their sacrifice closed a bloody chapter in American history. But it was a chapter that closed with confusion, not clarity, with a questionable victory, not a clear resolution. The Vietnam era ended the way it had been conducted, with mistakes, miscommunication, and men dying for objectives that weren't clearly defined. Today, Koh Tang is a quiet island. Tourists occasionally visit. The jungle has reclaimed the beaches where Marines fought and bled. There are no memorials, no markers, nothing to indicate what happened there. But the men who survived remember. Every year, fewer of them remain. They gather to honor their fallen brothers and to remember a battle that most Americans have forgotten. The Mayaguez herself returned to service after the incident. She sailed commercially until 1979, when she was scrapped, an ordinary cargo ship that briefly became a symbol of American resolve and American desperation. What does the Mayaguez Incident teach us? It teaches us that military force can be driven by political needs rather than military necessity. It teaches us that bad intelligence can get good men killed. It teaches us that victory is often a matter of perception, not reality. And it teaches us that pride, national pride, wounded pride, desperate pride, can be a dangerous motivator. The 41 Americans who lost their lives in the Mayaguez operation deserve to be remembered honestly. They were brave men who followed orders. They fought courageously against overwhelming odds. They didn't know that the hostages had already been released. They didn't know that their sacrifice was, in a tactical sense, unnecessary. They did their duty, and they paid the ultimate price. They deserve more than a footnote in history. They deserve recognition for what they actually did, not what politicians said they did. 41 Americans lost, 40 hostages saved. A victory that cost more lives than it saved. A last battle fought for a lost war. This is the story of the Mayaguez Incident. Now you know what really happened. Subscribe for more hidden military history. Share this video so the 41 are remembered honestly. Comment, was this a victory or a failure? This video is for the Marines of Koh Tang and all who served in the Mayaguez operation. They deserved better leadership. They deserved the truth.